From South Carolina Public Radio, this is Walter Edgar's Journal. This week we are digging into our broadcast archives to bring you an encore of an episode that is perfect for this 250th anniversary year of the start of the American Revolution. Walter's guest is Dr. Woody Holton of the University of South Carolina, and they will be talking about Holton's book, Liberty is Sweet, The Hidden History of the American Revolution. Liberty is Sweet has been described as a deeply researched and bracing retelling of the Revolution, which shows how the founders were influenced by overlooked Americans. Women, Native Americans, African Americans, and religious dissenters.
Let's talk about what is the hidden history of the American Revolution? What have you dug up?
Well, mostly what I've done is tell the traditional story in chronological order, but with a slightly different take on each incident. And one that I've been thinking about a lot lately, because I know you're an expert on this one, is the Battle of Cowpens. January 17th, 1781. And what interests me about cowpens most of all, we could talk about a lot of aspects of it, are the maps. Because almost every map, in fact, every map that I could find of cowpens places the Broad River right behind General Morgan's
It's about
camp.
5 miles away.
They all get it wrong. And there's a reason I think they get it wrong is that Morgan said at the time that he was 5 miles from the river, but years later he said, no, I backed my army up against the Broad River so that sort of as a backstop, so they wouldn't run away. And that's because I had militia. And as you know, he used militia very effectively at Cowpens. It's kind of fairly well represented in Mel Gibson's movie, The Patriot, how they fired first and then ran, and then the oncoming Tarleton's troops had to deal with the Continental. He used them well, but then he also used them in another sense after the battle to explain a mistake that he'd made and that could have cost him the battle. It didn't. Of course, it was a great American victory. But what Morgan's mistake was the same one that Buford had made earlier the previous year, and that is he let Bannister Tarleton catch up with him. Morgan, although we know that he won, but when he was there on January 17th, a couple hours before dawn, he got word that Tarleton was just a few hours away, and so Morgan was not able to do the smart thing he had planned to do, which was to get on the other side of Broad River and then defend the river. It's much easier to defend a river than it is to defend your army in an open field. So he got stuck in this open field and in fact said in a letter that he wrote just 9 days after the battle, they were starting to turn my flank, so I had no choice but to attack the British head on, and of course he won.
He got caught by events, and like a good commander, he made the best of a bad situation. Now, what is different when you walk the Cowpens battlefield now had you walked it 20 years ago? 20 years ago, it had been turned over a century into a sentimental Victorian park with trees and everything. So it was open.
Right.
But the hills were the terrain was important. Tarleton did not see how Morgan had arranged his troops.
Right, and that's one of the things that's wrong in the movie. Given it's not a big mistake, but they kind of imply in the movie The Patriot that Morgan had hidden his army behind the hills. I think it was just a natural advantage, but it sure helped.
Well, there are a lot of things about The Patriot, and we could spend 4 shows talking about Hollywood and history. It's interesting what Morgan said later about he was afraid they were going to run. But as you know, at West Point, at the Command and General Staff School, the Battle of Cowpens is still taught. It is a classic double envelopment.
Absolutely.
So what we're very nicely saying is that in years after the battle, Daniel Morgan did a revisionist history.
Right. And the map, and I don't blame him. I mean, that's sort of human nature. And I'm not even mad at the map makers, but I do think it's intriguing because we all talk about how historians of various generations have their biases. I'm very aware of my biases. We all have them, but map makers have those biases too.
So what are your biases since you're a 21st century historian?
Well, my biases are those that I think most people share with me, that we're just acutely conscious of our internal conflicts in America. Many people think that the United States of 2021 looks a lot like the United States in the 1850s, where there's regional conflict and ethnic and other kinds of conflict. But I'm really conditioned by that conflict that we're engaged in now to look for conflict in the 18th century. And I think, just to anticipate what a critic might say, that critic might say, well, you may be seeing conflict where it's not there. But that's why I say I think a person reading about the American Revolution should read, say, my friend, I'll call him my frenemy, Gordon Wood, who is really the dean of scholarship on the American Revolution and a fantastic writer. He doesn't play down conflict entirely, but he doesn't stress conflict. You could almost call him a consensus writer, even when he writes about the ratification or the adoption of the Constitution, which was a very conflicted thing. He will tend to focus on what people agreed on, and it's easier to do that when you focus only on wealthy white men who are writing the documents, which is his primary focus. It's not the only people he talks about, but that's his focus. So my point is, read Gordon Wood's book, but read mine too, and then figure out somewhere in the middle what you may.
Well, see, ironically, an older, more popular history like Miracle at Philadelphia actually dealt with the conflicts.
Well, can I say in response to that real quick? I think we can't count on progress in history writing. I'd like to think that things get better and better, but sometimes. And of course, it's all in the eyes of the beholder. But sometimes we historians, like everybody else, we regress.
Well, I want to talk about two things about the physical nature of your book before we get into more discussion. One is the title. You took that from a quotation. Explain that for me. Liberty is sweet.
Well, a whole lot in my book is meant to, I don't want to say deceive, but to kind of put people off their guard a little bit, because the phrase "liberty is sweet" sounds like it might be something Patrick Henry said or some other active person in the Revolution, but it actually comes from a guy named Lund Washington, who was a cousin of General Washington and who ran Mount Vernon while George Washington was off outside Boston, bottling the British up in Boston with his newly formed Continental Army. So early in 1776, Lund writes George saying, I'm sorry to report to you that the servants as well as the slaves here at Mount Vernon are thinking about running away from Mount Vernon because there are so many opportunities provided to servants and slaves by the war. Any war leads to chaos, and people who feel oppressed can take advantage of that chaos to get away. But also, as you know, Walter, not everybody does, that the British had issued an Emancipation Proclamation in 1775, so right before Lund Washington wrote George Washington. And so that's what Lund Washington was talking about when he said liberty is sweet. He said, we're going to have to deal with people that you own, George, escaping to the British because liberty is sweet and they want a taste.
All right, so are you talking about Lord Dunmore's proclamation in Virginia?
Yes.
So because that really was not continental-wide, it's specifically with Virginia, right?
He said, he put a lot of conditions on it, but he said if you can get to my side and if you're owned by a patriot and you're able and willing to bear arms, which seems to imply men, although the majority of the people who joined him were women and kids. So if you meet all those conditions, then you are enlisted. He didn't say specifically Virginians, but you're right. He was targeting Virginians. But I think it's worth saying, and I think you would have a lot to contribute to this, Walter, from your expertise, that there was some cooperation with the British Navy captains in Charleston Harbor with the enslaved people who escaped to Sullivan's Island. And I really like talking about that because you've mentioned several times on the Journal that Sullivan's Island is what my dissertation advisor, Peter Wood, called the Ellis Island of Black Americans, since something like 2/3 of our African, or more than half of our African ancestors came through Sullivan's Island, where they had to perform quarantine. So it's the entrance to slavery. It's also the exit from slavery for a small number of people, of Black South Carolinians, in late 1775. And so you're right, there wouldn't be another formal Emancipation Proclamation until 1779, when Henry Clinton issued one as he was getting ready to invade or liberate the South. But there was informal cooperation, and much more than that, there was a belief among whites that there was informal cooperation between the British and the blacks, so much so that when the South Carolinians adopted their militia association in 1775, they cited, okay, generally Lord North is a tyrant, the Prime Minister of Britain, and second reason they gave was Lexington and Concord, and the third one was instigated insurrections. There's a lot in those two words. Slave revolts, but not just slave revolts that were instigated by the British. So they probably weren't very correct that the British governor was supportive either in North Carolina or South Carolina of African Americans, or it was probably more true that the Royal Navy captains were. But what's definitely true is that whites thought that royal officials were cooperating with African Americans.
Yes, and of course there is the incident where a free black harbor pilot is hanged.
Thomas Jeremiah.
And at the end of the Revolution, South Carolina's enslaved population had decreased by 25%.
Yes, but here's how my view changed, partly after reading Sylvia Frey's book. She has sadly just died, a wonderful historian of the war in the South and of religion in the South. But she points out that the British were really bad allies to African Americans. Yes, they did keep their promise to many. If you can reach our lines, we'll recruit you to fight on our side and reward you with freedom at the end of the war. But they also were doing the same thing that Thomas Sumter was doing, which was capturing slaves owned by the enemy and not liberating them, but just transferring them from one owner to another. And probably we can say in most cases worse conditions because go ahead.
Well, and of course, how else could a young British officer buy his next promotion?
Absolutely. There were a couple of British officers who made a killing, and you could almost say that literally because for blacks, almost as much as for whites, a trip to the Caribbean, or in Virginia, they often sent them to the lead mines near where I was born in southwestern Virginia. Those are death sentences.
Well, there is that wonderfully mysterious Black Carolina Corps.
Yes, which I know you've talked to my graduate student, Gary Selleck, or former graduate student, now Dr. Selleck, who is one of the editors of the Thomas Jefferson papers today, wrote his dissertation on the Carolina Corps, who were formed here in South Carolina, as their name indicates, but then went on to heroic service in the British Army after the American Revolutionary War in the Caribbean. But I should put heroic in quotation marks because a lot of what this Black Carolina Corps did for the British Army was put down slave rebellions by other Africans. But my favorite part of the Carolina Corps story occurred back when they were still here in Carolina in 1782, and that is there's these scattered references, which neither Gary nor I have been able to really pin down, but Gary's got more on it than I do, to black dragoons. And most of your listeners know that a dragoon is a guy on a horse. And to me, that's a hell of an image after all these years of slavery to see a troop of African Americans on their horses with their sabers looking a little bit like Tarleton's Legion.
That would have been every white settler's nightmare.
Absolutely.
But you forgot to mention their regimental tune, which is Carolina in a Sultry Clime.
Ooh, I did not know about that.
Yeah, so, I mean, that followed them to the Caribbean until the unit was eventually disbanded.
Right.
But it lasted for several generations.
Yeah, and I think they started, I'm trying to remember from Gary's dissertation, which he's now working on to be a book, because I think they folded them in. The British continued to use black soldiers, but I think the later ones were not treated as well. They were sort of drafted into it, whereas these guys were more voluntary.
And Woody, before we get back to our general discussion, the cover to your book also tells the story. How about sharing that one?
Thanks for asking. You remember I said before the break that there's a sense in which I'm trying to catch people off their guard. So Liberty is Sweet, you're supposed to think it's Patrick Henry, but then you find out that it's referring to enslaved people. The cover image is meant to do the same thing. And I really need to credit Ellen McAllister Clark, who's the librarian of the American Revolution Institute and the Society of Cincinnati up in Washington. Because I was giving a talk. I was getting ready to give a talk down in Charleston to the Society of the Cincinnati, which is the first sons of Revolutionary War officers all the way back. Anyway, I was giving a talk down in Charleston, and they said, we really want you to talk about women in the Revolutionary War. And so I think I asked them, would you ask Ellen to see if she can find me any images? And she sent me a lithograph done in the early to mid-19th century of three British, I guess they're officers, but three British guys in their red coats on horses, and they're being waylaid by two Americans on foot. And it's telling a true story of these British officers who were carrying a message through the South Carolina backcountry. So basically where you and I are talking right now, somewhere not too far from Columbia, although closer to Augusta, Georgia. Anyway, they were carrying a message for a British officer when they were waylaid by these Americans who took their messages and sent them to an American commander and really helped the American cause by doing that. But I almost was ready to write Ellen back and say, no, but I needed something depicting women. And had I done so, she would have said, look again. Because we have these three British officers on their horses, but the two Americans confronting them are wearing men's clothing, but both of them are actually women. So I was so thrilled with that, and my audience at the museum, the History Museum in Charleston, was too, that I decided that would be my cover. And the designers of the book at Simon & Schuster did a great job of zooming in. So you're only looking at two guys on horses being waylaid by this one guy, but that guy who's waylaying them is not a guy. It's one of the Martin sisters.
One of the Martin sisters. I was going to make sure you got their names out there.
Rachel and Elizabeth Martins. And I say sisters, I misspoke because they are sisters-in-law. They both married Martin brothers. I'm pretty honest in my book about the fact that this story was told by Elizabeth Elliot, and before her by one of the early 19th century South Carolina historians. I think it was Mills, actually, had told this story. So I could say it's got multiple sourcing, but I never found a source from 1780 confirming the story. So I admitted, I don't know if I used the word apocryphal, but I wouldn't bet my mortgage on it. Would you, though? Do you think it really happened?
I don't know, but you mentioned Elliot. It's the source that is connected to South Carolina. She was here for a while. But to me, the revolutionary heroine that I always bring out is Jane Black Thomas.
Yeah, that's a wonderful story.
I always compare that to Paul Revere's ride, not very nicely. I mean, hell, all he did was ride down a paved road, and didn't even to say the British are coming. This woman over 60 steals a horse, rides through 50 miles of occupied territory to warn the Spartan regiment, which then ambushes a British raid.
Yes, I agree with you. She's much more Paul Revere than Paul Revere was. Not to take anything from him, but he's part of this whole network of people that, William Dawes was also on a horse, and the guy with the lanterns, Old North Church, where they hung the two lanterns. And so that was sending the message out. And again, this was a collective effort. This wasn't a lone ranger. And in fact, people in New Hampshire knew the British, quote unquote British, were coming. The regulars were out before they even started marching.
Just think if Longfellow had been Mrs. Thomas's descendant, then we would have known.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of things that rhyme with Thomas. Revere has lots of things that rhyme with it, but he would have figured it out, and that would have been. But of course, the reason he did it, nothing against Longfellow, he's living in the 19th century. There were precious few Elizabeth Elliots in the 19th century to get the word out to Longfellow. Now, William Gilmore Simms, I'm told by an undergraduate student of mine and a recent winner of the Walter Edgar Fellowship, named Riley Sutherland. Riley is discovering that William Gilmore Simms and Elizabeth Elliot, it may be proper to describe them as frenemies. You may know that she later got into a real row with Edgar Allan Poe, but she and William Gilmore Simms were friendly. And it's amazing to pick up her book, Women of the American Revolution, I think it's simply called, but it was published in 1848, the same year as the Seneca Falls Declaration. And you pick it up thinking, well, this is probably some northern lady because they're so progressive. For instance, they're mostly anti-slavery up there. But that's not the case at all. It's mostly about Southern women, and it's mostly not about Southern women who sat at home as they're properly supposed to do in the 19th century formulation, making needlepoint or whatever. They were out there. A bunch of them were kicking ass.
Yeah. And actually, you mentioned Simms. He has a whole series of revolutionary novels that the history in them is pretty good. And he is not squeamish about discussing the violence of what was basically a civil war in the Carolina backcountry.
Yeah. Can I say real briefly on the violence? Because there's a recent movement among my generation of historians who think they're discovering that the revolution was violent. And what they're really doing is rediscovering that it was violent.
I'm sorry. I've been riding the Revolutionary War in the South, hobby horse, for about 25 years, and now I don't feel like I'm the Lone Ranger.
Yes. Well, and I don't want to get back into all the errors, especially with regard to African Americans in the Patriot, but I do give it credit for one thing. It did let people know there was a Revolutionary War in the South, and hopefully from there they'll get to Partisans and Rebels, or my book, or the wonderful work of Jim Peacoach or Buchanan. There's a lot of great scholarship. Who wrote that book? The Southern Strategy. I'm forgetting it. Wilson, I think is his first name. There's a bunch of good scholarship on the war in the South. And, of course, Charles Baxter is still producing all that amazing Southern campaigns.
I'll say one more thing, then we won't discuss the Patriot again, and that is he gets one thing right, why people in South Carolina were fighting. Either they started off as they believed in the Declaration of Independence and they were fighting. And that's, of course, the son in the movie. He signs up as the Continental to begin with. Right. The other is the dad, supposedly Francis Marion, only does it once his child has been killed and his home has been burned.
Right.
Vengeance. I mean, so he got that right.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Think of Marion or Sumter, who his wife, took this heroic stand of refusing to tell them where he was. Go ahead. She
was crippled. Not a complete invalid, but she was.
When the British came to her house and said, "Where's your husband?" Yeah. She sort of, she's from her bed or whatever, says, "Not here." And so presumably they carried her out and laid her on the lawn before they burned her house down.
Yeah.
Huh. Did not know that.
Yeah. And she was, today we'd say, a woman of privilege, but she just said, to heck with it. There's so many cases people say, "Oh, that's exaggerated," of these frontier housewives standing up to the British. But we've got British accounts that these Scots-Irish hussies.
Right. Well, and at Blackstock's, it was a woman whose name, unfortunately, we don't have, who rode ahead, somewhat similar to Jane Thomas, who rode ahead of Tarleton's Legion and warned them that I think he'd sent his cavalry ahead and was leaving the artillery and infantry were going to come up a few hours later. So that was the chance to knock out the cavalry, to disable them a little bit because they were outnumbered for that short period, all because a woman got on a horse.
Yeah. Woody, let's get back to the hidden history. And in my reading, what it is, you're telling a story, the story of the Revolution, and you're making sure that all participants are included. It's not just George Washington, Thomas Jefferson. It's not just Thomas Sumter and Francis Marion. We've already talked about Jane Black Thomas, the women. Francis Marion, as we know, one of the reasons that Gates didn't like working with him is because he had enslaved and free persons of color in his band. So that's something that when many people talk about the history of the Revolution, it is the snare and the bugle and nice white boys walking across the field.
Right.
We haven't touched on the Native Americans, and that's a big part of the story, particularly here in South Carolina. The South as well. I mean, the Cherokee frontier went from Georgia to Virginia.
So yes, let me talk briefly about Native Americans in the run-up to the Revolution, to the war, because one I thought exciting discovery that I made was I finally sat down and read the Stamp Act, which nothing can sound more boring, but it's a reminder that all the history books are wrong when they say that the purpose of the money raised by the Stamp Act was to help pay off the huge debt that Britain had coming out of the French and Indian War. No, it was to pay for troops. 10,000 troops would be left in America, some in the Caribbean, but the bulk on the border, and I think it's proper to call them peacekeeping troops because they were on the western borders of the British colonies to keep the Indians away from the colonists, but also to keep the colonists away from the Indians so that the colonists wouldn't provoke another war against the Indians because, of course, wars are the most expensive thing that governments do. And that's going to cost something like £300,000 a year. And it's quite reasonable from Parliament's perspective that if we're going to put these troops on the western border to protect the colonists, then the colonists should pay for them. And I would even go so far, Walter, as just sort of a provocation to say, had there been no Indians or Native Americans, there would have been no Stamp Act, because that's what the money was needed for, is those peacekeeping troops on the western border. Then once the war gets started, it allows me to mention a couple of things that I want to say. The Declaration of Independence, sadly, because it's such a beautiful document in its entirety, but sadly what it says about Native Americans is that the British have excited, to quote it, the merciless Indian savages. And it just makes me so sad that our founding document has this racist phrase, merciless Indian savages, but we need to confront the circumstances of its creation as well as the beauties of the Declaration itself.
And that was, I would say, continental-wide, because the British had divided control of the Native American affairs after I'll just use the term French and Indian War, which is what most people.
Right.
I prefer the Great War for the Empire. But
yeah, it's much more descriptive.
But it used to be each colony handled its own Indian affairs. But then after that, they said it's going to be, we're going to have a continental-wide. So they had a northern Indian agent and a southern Indian agent. The southern was John Stewart, who was based out of Charleston. And so he was responsible for everything for Virginia South, mostly dealing with the Cherokee on the frontier here. And one of the things that particularly frontiersmen in South Carolina, we need to remember that the Indian frontier, Greenville, present-day Greenville, Oconee, Pickens County, that was Indian territory.
Right. Where Clemson is now, right? Is it Clemson or across the river from Clemson? That was the town of Seneca, a Cherokee town.
Yeah. The lower towns of the Cherokee were there. But the folks living in Spartan District, as it was then called, which was allowed to settlement after the French and Indian War, they were always afraid that the Indians were going to come after them because they kept pushing up against the mountains, settling up against the mountains.
Right.
And when the revolution does break out, there is an attack on the frontier, but it's, yes, some of the Cherokee involved, but a lot of them, let's go back to the Indians at the Boston Tea Party, or Tories dressed up like Indians on the Carolina frontier to really get this myth going out. The British are loosing the savagery on the frontier.
Well, that raises a larger issue for me, which is I was astonished to see how many loyalists were willing to join in bands of Native American. A lot of these were mixed-race bands. And, of course, Marion's and Sumter's bands were mixed-race as well. And that goes all the way back to the South Carolina regulation, right, where some of the regulators were African-American or mixed race. And then one of the things they were doing was enforcing things against African-Americans. So one of the things I mentioned at the start, all these present-day conflicts that affect my view of the past, some of those modern-day conflicts are along ethnic lines. But the 18th century is a reminder, don't get too fixed in your notions of ethnicity, because anytime you see a white band, there's probably a native or a couple of African Americans. And anytime you see a Cherokee band, there's a couple of white loyalists fighting with it and so forth. So it's much more mixed up in reality than in people's perceptions. But to talk about the Cherokee War, as you know, they blamed John Stuart, and they came close to arresting him, and perhaps worse than arresting him. He escaped to St. Augustine, which Florida was, of course, one of the 13 British colonies that remained loyal to the crown when the other 13 that we are more familiar with rebelled. But so he got away, but there was a strong suspicion that the British were stirring up the Indians. The reality is that in 1775 and early 1776, the British were trying to restrain the Cherokees. They were hoping to attack the colonists with help from the Cherokees and have sort of a two-pronged attack, but they weren't ready for it to start yet. And so they kept telling the Cherokees, no, not yet. We'll tell you when it's time for you Cherokees to launch your attacks on the colonists. And here's proof that the Indians were not the puppets of the British, because the Cherokees did attack when they wanted to, which was in the spring of 1776 because of some horrible things that the colonists had done to them. So they attacked on their own timeline, not when the British told them to. And I think I'm right, Walter, and you'll be the person to check this with, but when the South Carolina colonists exacted their revenge on the Cherokee and, of course, attacked right as the corn crop was getting ready to be harvested so they could burn it all, the first South Carolinian to die in that battle was in that town of Seneca, near where Clemson University is today. The first guy to die was Francis Salvador,
yes,
who was Jewish. I just think that shows the complexity of early America, that whites fighting natives, the first guy to go down is Jewish.
And Francis Salvador was the first. He was a member of the Provincial Congress. He was the first person of Jewish faith to be elected to a Western parliamentary body.
Anywhere in the
world.
In the Western world. That is very
And it was
cool.
the Provincial Congress of South Carolina.
You'll be happy, I hope, to hear that when I lecture on colonial America, I talk about Pennsylvania as this great polyglot community, people of different faiths, people of different languages, but so was South Carolina.
Except if you were Roman Catholic, didn't want them.
Right.
But you had everybody else.
Yeah, it is amazing. Now, I think you and I would agree that it's a little bit of the philosophy of John Locke working its way into the fundamental constitutions, but it's also they needed labor. It's kind of why Wyoming became the first state to let women vote in 1876, because they were trying to attract women. I think Utah was the second. Not exactly hotbeds of liberal progressivism, but places that needed women.
All right, Woody, let's talk about a little bit more about the Native American situation, because it's not the same North and South. The proclamation line going back to 1763. Draw this line, we're going to separate the colonists on this side, the Native Americans on the other side. That's British imperial policy. How does George Washington react to that?
His initial reaction, he called it a temporary expedient to quiet the minds of the Indians. And I want to stress the last few words of that, quiet the minds of the Indians. He understood that Native Americans were central to British policy. And again, as with African Americans, the British didn't do this thing that was favorable to the Indians out of the kindness of their hearts or out of being open-minded. Oh, these are people that deserve to keep their land. No, they didn't want to pay for another war against the Indians. But Washington's initial reaction was they can't keep doing this. They can't maintain the proclamation of 1763. And in fact, they were never able to maintain it very much against actual settlers because it's only a paper barrier. It's not like they built a Great Wall of China along the crest of the Appalachian Mountains. And so if you're just somebody who wants to go settle in Kentucky, you go. On the other hand, if you're somebody like George Washington, Washington also said, the greatest estates we have in this colony were made by taking up the rich backlands, which were thought nothing of in those days, but are now among the most valuable we possess. Washington, Jefferson, just about anybody you can name in Virginia, and Benjamin Franklin in Pennsylvania, many others were land speculators. Now, the reality is that Washington, he made his biggest money by marrying Martha Dandridge Custis. But he wanted to build on that, and I think there was sort of a sense of manhood there, too, of if I want to be somebody who's building his own fort. And he did. He was one of the biggest landowners in the colonies by the time of the Revolution, mostly that speculative Western land. But the British cut it all off with the Proclamation Line of 1763 and never actually repealed it. And the reason they never repealed it, I think if I had to say one group most responsible for that, it was the female peace chiefs in the Native American towns on the Wabash River in what's currently Indiana. Because in 1769, the same year that the Virginia House of Burgesses, meeting in what we now call Colonial Williamsburg, sent a petition to the British saying, please, please repeal the Proclamation Line of 1763 and let us take that Western land, especially Kentucky. In that same year, these female peace chiefs initiated an alliance that brought in almost all of the nations north of the Ohio River. So what's now the Midwest, Ohio, Indiana,
and
Illinois.
That's a pretty incredible accomplishment.
Oh, yes. They had often been enemies of each other. And the even bigger accomplishment, they crossed the Ohio River into Kentucky and what's now Kentucky, Tennessee. Before 1769, if you lived north of the river, you were enemies of the nations like the Muskogees or Creeks and the Cherokees. And yet, these women initiated this alliance in 1769 that is finally bringing the Indian nations north of the Ohio River into alliance with the Indian nations south of the Ohio River. And the British found out, and that's what convinced the British to say yes to the Indians and no to Virginians like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson were both part of that unanimous vote in the Virginia House of Burgesses saying, let us have Kentucky. The British said, no, you can't have Kentucky. We're leaving it.
This is the nightmare of not just the settlers, but also of royal officials, Indian confederacies.
Absolutely. What is scary, and Governor Hillsborough, for whom Hillsborough, North Carolina, is named, said in 1772, what these intel reports were telling Hillsborough, who was the Secretary of State for America over in Britain, that this coalition that these Native women had started, and he said, we'll soon be involved in a general Indian war. That's the one that's scary. A war against a single Indian nation, not so much, but a general Indian war. It's not like they're going to be able to drive the colonists. There were 2.5 million colonists in the 13 colonies that rebelled by 1776. They're not going to be able to drive them into the Atlantic Ocean, but they are going to be able to launch a big enough war that is going to cost Britain millions of pounds sterling to put it down.
Yeah, and of course, eventually the Cherokee War erupts on the frontier, and the colonists from Virginia to Georgia unite. They make a common cause against the Cherokee all along the frontier. It's not one colony by itself. Just as one of the stories of Kings Mountain is there were militia from Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia, and the over-the-mountain boys. Kings Mountain wasn't just these people who, Sevier and the boys didn't just come across the mountain. They weren't the only ones there. It was a strange amalgamation of all these frontier militia that made Kings Mountain a success.
Absolutely, absolutely. That and those colonels. The most amazing thing to me about Kings Mountain is that they succeeded so successfully when it was, and you can correct me if I'm wrong about this, Walter, but it looks to me it was run by committee. That is, there was no one guy, there was no general there. It was all colonels.
They couldn't agree.
Right. And yet those guys, and not to take anything away from Morgan, who we talked about at the beginning, but that, of course, that victory was on October 1780. The way they achieved that victory is that, in my opinion, the sort of guts of that win was that those colonels understood that militiamen are not cowards. Militiamen are guys carrying rifles. You cannot expect a person carrying a rifle to charge, because a rifle, you can't put a bayonet on a rifle. And once you fired your one shot, it takes 3 times as long to reload your rifle as it does to load a musket. And so it would have been insane to have them all charge at once. And so what they did was say, go up to the top of the mountain, get close to the Brits, fire a volley, and then run away. And go back down the mountain far enough to be able to reload when you're not under fire and then come back up. They programmed running away into their strategy, and it really worked.
And to use the traditional frontier method to fight behind rocks and trees and that sort of thing. The very ungentlemanly way that they fought the war.
Yes, which Native Americans, of course, had been using. We talk about people like Francis Marion as an old Indian fighter. He certainly was, but he was also an old Indian learner that he'd learned a lot of his tactics from the Native Americans he'd been fighting.
Well, and of course, here in the South, Nathaniel Greene was probably the first Continental to really understand the way to use militia.
Absolutely. And talking about Greene, you've probably had various people quote a dozen times on the Journal, but it's worth repeating his wonderful line, "We fight, we get beat, we fight again." He understood that what he was fighting was a war of attrition. They did not need to drive the British into the Atlantic. They did not need to capture New York City. All they needed to do was wait them out. Washington, on the other hand, came into the war determined to have this grand, epic battle where you throw the dice and risk everything on this. He wanted to do an amphibious assault against Boston, then later plans a string of amphibious assaults against the British in New York. But the thing you have to give Washington credit for is not acting on any of those plans, because going on offense, we saw it at Stono Ferry and in other cases, is just as disastrous for the Americans as it is for the British.
All right, Woody, what is your favorite hidden story that you uncovered?
My favorite thing that I discovered wasn't something I get credit for, but Eric Slaughter, who's a literary historian up at the University of Chicago, he discovered who was the first person to quote the Declaration of Independence. We know who wrote it, who was the first person to quote it, and it was Lemuel Haynes, who was a free black soldier serving in the Continental Army. He had a white mother and a black father, so they referred to him as black in those days. And he wrote, sitting at the campfire one night during his Continental Army service, he wrote an anti-slavery pamphlet called Liberty Further Extended. And his epigraph was, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal," and the rest that you know. And that became the first time anybody quoted that. And here's the significance of that. Very few other people during the next quarter century quoted that part of the Declaration of Independence. They were mostly focused on the Declaration of Independence as basically the severing of an alliance between 13 parts of the British Empire.
A secession document.
I think you should call it an ordinance of secession. I completely agree with you, because what's Congress trying to do? They're trying to break up with Britain so that they can form an alliance with France. The real audience of the decision to declare independence on July 2nd, not the document, but the decision to break it, make it official, the audience for that was Louis XVI, the King of France. One discovery I did make was that in June of 1776, members of Congress were saying to each other, if we do this decision to declare independence quick enough, we'll have a French Navy in American waters by August of this year, 1776. And so that was the real goal of the Declaration. And in that goal of bringing the French immediately into the war, the Declaration of Independence failed, because, as you know, it would be another 2 years before a French Navy and a French army came to America. They had secretly been supporting it before the Declaration and continued to, but the Declaration as an effort to get a French Navy into American waters by August 1776 was a failure. A student of mine sort of reproduced Professor Slaughter's research and found this amazing thing. The Declaration, the part of it that's now the iconic part, all men are created equal, that got quoted 27 more times in the 18th century until 1799, in newspapers and pamphlets and all that, 27 more times. Of those 27 quotations of the Declaration of Independence, 8 were by people who were not writing anti-slavery documents. 19 of the quotations from the Declarations, all men are created equal, came from abolitionists, both black and white, Benjamin Banneker along with Lemuel Haynes. And so what those abolitionists did was shift the focus of the Declaration of Independence from the right of secession to all men are created equal. And they turned this failed secession document into the most successful freedom document ever created.
Woody, I cannot add anything to that. That's beautifully said. Professor Woody Holton, author of Liberty is Sweet, The Hidden History of the American Revolution. Thanks so much for being with us today on The Journal.
Thank you for joining us for this encore episode of Walter Edgar's Journal. In his book, Liberty is Sweet, The Hidden History of the American Revolution, Woody Holton has used more than 1,000 eyewitness records to explore countless connections between the patriots of 1776 and other Americans whose passion for freedom often brought them into conflict with the Founding Fathers. It's a complex history with many actors, but as Woody writes, it is all one story. Walter Edgar's Journal is a production of South Carolina Public Radio. I'm Alfred Turner, and I produce the show, which is made possible by listener contributions to the ETV Endowment of South Carolina. Remember, the views and opinions expressed on Walter Edgar's Journal are not necessarily those of South Carolina Public Radio or its underwriters. Many of the books discussed on Walter Edgar's Journal can be found as part of the Walter Edgar's Journal Book Nook section at all good books in Columbia, South Carolina, or may be available from your local bookstore. We'll talk again soon.